Now, when we look at the Bible, pretty much from the end, well, I don't know. Let me see. Let me look at this. The end of Genesis, like towards the end of Genesis. So, for people who know the Bible pretty good, there is a portion where it's like you see the Israelites, or, before they were even called the Israelites, right? Because the name Israelites comes from Joseph's father, Jacob, right? So if you remember way back in the Bible, when Jacob and Esau were born, and, so Jacob and Esau were, let's see, sorry, I'm kind of looking back. Isaac's kids, and Isaac was the son, or I guess technically one of the sons of Abraham. Abram turned to Abraham. There was also the other son, Ishmael, which was not Sarai or Sarah's biological son, but was Abraham's biological son through through one of, I believe, the maidservants of Sarai or Sarah. So Abram's name gets changed to Abraham. Sarai's name gets changed to Sarah. Eventually Esau is born. Jacob is born. Esau is born. Sorry, I'm messing this up. Eventually, Isaac was born, and Ishmael was born. So the history of, the culture and religion of Islam follows Ishmael's lineage from Abraham. The culture of Judaism follows Isaac's lineage through Abraham. Isaac has these sons, Esau and Jacob. I don't know if you, so let me see, I think, does Esau get killed? Isaac dies. Esau, I'm confused about what really happens with Esau, but Jacob basically has all these sons, right, that are listed. So Jacob has Joseph, eventually, but there were a whole lot of sons, right? So if you look at Jacob's lineage, and you see the name interchanged often after a certain point, so you see the Hebrews, which were the Israelites, that's like the same thing. Basically, Jacob's name becomes Israel. Jacob becomes Israel, right? The name gets changed to Israel. And so when you see Israel, it's the descendants of basically Jacob is the same person, who is Esau's brother, right? And they were the sons of basically um, the sons of Isaac. So they were the grandsons of Abraham. So Israel is Abraham's grandson, basically, or Israel, Jacob, Abraham's grandson. So that's how Israel begins being called the Israelites eventually. But technically, you see the term Hebrews also being used to distinguish between the Hebrews and the Egyptians. They're not necessarily called always the Israelites, but you still see the terminology. Egyptians, Israelites, Hebrews, Israel, Jacob. You see these names just like all over the place. And so if you look at the history, basically that's how Joseph eventually comes into the picture. So Israel, or Jacob, basically brings his, well, I guess if you go with the stories in order, I don't want to get like way too deep into it, but basically Joseph's brothers sell him into slavery during the book of Genesis. This was, I don't know, let me see, I'm trying to find where it is. I don't know if it matters that much where it is actually, but I'm just like flipping through pages here. But we eventually get to the place where there's a famine in Egypt, right? Sorry, I kind of lost my place here. Now I'm like flipping around. But the reason why I'm talking about this is because there is a time period where you start seeing Hebrews in Egypt. They weren't like never there. They were there at a certain point. And so I'm just trying to find a chapter where that comes up. Descendants of Esau. And then you have Joseph. So in chapter 37 of Genesis, Joseph gets sold into slavery, and eventually it says, in 37:28, they took Joseph to Egypt, right? And so if you're interested in who are the brothers and therefore the lineage of Israel, which would include, Joseph, basically you have at the very beginning of Exodus, it talks about eventually Jacob or Israel coming to Egypt. That's like eventually later on. So you basically have the sons. There are the sons of Israel, basically Reuben, Simeon, Levi, Judah, Issachar, Zebulun, Benjamin, Dan, Naphtali, Gad, or Gad, Asher, and Joseph. Uh, and basically, what happens is, Joseph ends up in Egypt, right? Because he was sold into slavery. He becomes an interpreter of the dreams of Pharaoh. Um, During this, Joseph's brothers come to Egypt to buy grain because there's this famine. And eventually, you see Jacob bring his whole family to Egypt in Genesis chapter 46. And then there's a famine in Egypt. So in chapter 47 of Genesis, a famine starts occurring in Egypt. 47:13. And so it looks like that famine had spread, and basically Jacob, who's Israel, also eventually dies. Joseph eventually dies. Joseph is buried in a coffin in Egypt. That's kind of the last sentence in the book of Genesis. And then we start in Exodus with the lineage of Israel, Jacob. Basically, after Jacob had come to Egypt, basically. So Joseph's father, Israel, was in Egypt. Joseph died and was buried in Egypt. And then we start this whole story about the Israelites. In Exodus chapter 1:8, it starts talking about the Israelites, right? So there's a different king in rule from the time that Joseph was in Egypt, and when Israel was in Egypt. There's a whole different ruler after Jacob and Joseph die. There's a whole different ruler that comes into play in Egypt, and it says that this king in Egypt did not know Joseph, and so it seemed to have this type of prejudice against the Israelites, about them being more numerous and powerful than the Egyptians, because they were outnumbering them, and that's how this, I guess technically a political campaign was developed to maybe have like this strategy so that it looks like they didn't want the potential for the Israelites to be able to join in a war with the enemies and then together overpower Egypt. And so they enslaved the Hebrews and put them in charge of building what they call supply cities, the cities called Pithom and Ramesses. Those still exist. Also all different types of making hard labor, mortar and brick, and all kinds of field labor. Uh, and basically there were taskmasters put ahead of them to oppress them. I don't know if the taskmasters were Egyptian or Hebrews. But you kind of see this in history. There's a group of people who's in charge, and then there's another group of people who's like maybe a minority to some extent. Either they're maybe if they might not be like a numeric minority, but they still might be like oppressed in a way. And so it looks like there was a form of oppression from the Egyptian rulers against the Hebrews because of how numerous they were and just the potential for them to rise up against the Egyptians and take over the rule and become in charge. So to prevent this, the Egyptian king enslaved them. So this is just like a system that gets created, right? And you see it throughout history. It's not uncommon. I'm not saying it's right or whatever, but it's not uncommon for rulers to get this kind of paranoia that like that group over there needs to be oppressed because we can't have them rise up for reasons X, Y, and Z. That's not like an uncommon type of thinking. And so when you see them getting oppressed, and then basically, Pharaoh comes up with this idea of, having the Egyptian midwives, take watch over the birthing process of these Hebrew babies that were being born. It sounds like they're just popping out babies. I don't really know, but it sounds like there's a lot of babies being made, and it's getting to a point where it's concerning in a political way. And so I don't even know at this point if the famine is over. I'm gonna assume the famine ended during Joseph's years. I'm not 100% of those details of when the famine ended. I'd have to go back and read that, but I don't know the details of when that famine ended. But basically, there's this culture that's thriving after this famine, and it's after Joseph's lifetime, so it's a generation later at least. A different generation of ruler, a different generation of people, pretty much. And during that time period, the Egyptian women were put to, watch over the Hebrew women having babies to make sure that boy babies weren't led to survive. Pharaoh wanted the boy babies to all be killed, and the midwives didn't really agree. After that, he questions them, and they're like, oh, like they have the babies too fast or whatever, like they're too strong for us to like kill the baby before it's born. Like it would be like too obvious, basically. And so they've been letting them survive. But there is a comment in there about them being like believing in God. I don't know which God they believe in, but it seems like they believe in the Hebrew God. I don't really know, but that's kind of what it assumes with like the spelling and everything. Usually when you have a capital letter G-O-D with the first letter capitalized, that's the God of the Bible. That's not usually a God, like a different God, like a different idol or God that would be worshipped by a different culture. And then, so basically, the next phase is that Pharaoh says, throw the babies in the Nile. Every boy that gets born, throw them in the Nile. And they don't do that either. And so there's this passage that starts coming up about Moses. Mind you, we're still in Egypt. These people are all still in Egypt. So now, after Joseph's lineage, after Jacob dies, everybody's in Egypt from that point. And so, going back to Titus Kennedy and the arguments and things about people being in Egypt, according to the Bible, there were slaves that were Hebrews. There were taskmasters over these slaves. There was a campaign to kill the baby boys either by killing them at birth or drowning them and throwing them in the Nile. There was a campaign pretty much against the Hebrews, to keep their numbers down. They were enslaved. I don't know if slavery is considered a form of genocide. I don't really know what it's considered, but you know, they basically made them do forced labor of building and different types of field work, farming, things like that. Hard labor. And it looks like, too, that there was a role for, part of a role for women was, I guess, being a, what do you call it? Is it called a midwife? What's it called? Like a nurse? Like someone who nurses the babies? And so basically that's how Moses survives. So it doesn't say the name of Moses' mother, probably because she was a slave. But Moses gets an Egyptian name because he was basically in early days raised by Egyptians. So basically what happens, like it mentions basically the lineage of Moses being from the house of Levi at the beginning of chapter 2 in Exodus. Moses, so the father was from the house of Levi, and a Levite woman who likely had the same lineage. So remember when I mentioned all those names of Jacob, Israel's sons? Levi is one of those sons. And so Levi is from Jacob's lineage, one of his sons. So basically somebody from Levi's lineage that I don't know if they would even be alive by this point, because Joseph was dead, Jacob was dead. Let me see. I think that whole generation, yeah, because it says in 1:6, then Joseph died and all his brothers and that whole generation. So basically, the father and mother of Moses were from Jacob's son's lineage of Levi. So that was a generation before, or a whole, I don't know if it was one generation before, or basically it was long enough ago that the new king of Egypt during Moses' time didn't know Joseph and that whole family in Israel, Jacob, all those people, because they'd already been gone for that whole time period pretty much. So that's Moses' lineage coming from Levi, and that has a lot of significance. You start seeing later on in Genesis how the Levites have all these roles, these priestly roles, but basically what you see is this, there's nothing really mentioned about maybe priestliness. I don't know what the name Levi means. It probably says it in there, but I think Lev has to do with heart, right? Heart, love. I don't really know. I don't want to get way off topic because I want to look up names like and stuff like that. Like they interest me. But I'm not sure which of these names are Hebrew and which of these names are like Egyptian. Now when Joseph goes to Egypt, way back in Genesis, when he was sold into slavery and he gets into the courts and everything with Pharaoh, he basically gets a different name his name was not, he wasn't called Joseph. Um, I don't know what the name was, but he gets this different Egyptian name. And just similarly, there's a lot of name changing going on. But anyways, talking about Moses, so he basically survives because it says 3 months later, so his mother hid him, raised him for 3 months basically, and then it says when she could hide him no longer. Now, I don't know what hide him no longer means, but when she could hide him no longer, she basically puts him in a basket, in close enough distance for the sister to also be able to see. So it sounds like Moses had an older sister who was watching over this basket that baby Moses was in. And it doesn't even say what his name was. It doesn't say what his name was before, but basically he gets put into the river. Pharaoh's daughter comes to bathe in the river and sees the baby in the basket and asks one of the servants who were with her while she was bathing to go get the baby. And I don't know how they noticed that he must be one of the Hebrew children, one of the Hebrews' children. I don't understand how they would know that. Maybe they look different. Maybe I don't know, but maybe she just came to that conclusion. And that servant of Pharaoh's daughter goes and gets a Hebrew to nurse that baby, and it sounds like the person who starts to nurse the baby ends up calling Moses' actual mother to nurse him. Now that's what I'm not too certain about in 1:9. If it was the actual literal mother of Moses, or if it was someone who was like, you're his mother because you're nursing him. I don't really know about the culture in that way. But if you think about it, after Joseph and Jacob and all those other people, because all those brothers of Joseph as well, yeah, Jacob's whole household, all of their lineage moved into Egypt. They were all having kids in Egypt that whole time. So that whole generation was born in Egypt. They have their lineage attached to Jacob, but basically the whole lineage was born, in Egypt. And then to the point that there's a different king in power in Egypt, and that king enslaves all of the Hebrews. And so, yeah, there's a whole lot that goes on there. But for people to say that there's no proof of of Hebrews in Egypt, I mean, it sounds like there's, at least in the Bible, they talk a lot about the Hebrews being in Egypt. It sounds like for generations they were there, at least since Joseph, all those brothers died off, including Joseph, and up until Moses, they were pretty much there. I don't know how many generations that is, but it sounds like a long time. Because, mind you, these people were living pretty long, too. Like, I think Moses lived to be like 120 years old or something. Like, these people were old. And so baby Moses gets found. He gets named Moses. So the name in Hebrew, Moshe. But they derive the word from Masha, drew him out of the water. But that's how, like, I don't know Egyptian, so I don't really know. I don't really know Hebrew either, but I know more Hebrew than I know of, like, Egyptian, Arabic, any of those languages. So basically what happens, which is what I find interesting when you look at Moses' story, like, I'm not going to read the whole story. I'm going to talk about up until the part about the bricks being made of straw, pretty much. I'm going to talk pretty much up to that point. So basically what happens is Moses, it says he was, walking out when he was older. It doesn't say old. Like, it sounds like technically he was potentially raised around Pharaoh's daughter. Pharaoh's daughter named him. I don't know for how long Pharaoh's daughter was raising him, or if Moses' mother or the mother who was nursing him was raising him. But either way, they're all in Egypt. We know that they're in Egypt. So what happens is when Moses is older, he goes out and sees that his people were being forced to labor. So I don't know if he was aware of this. I don't know how he was aware of who his people were. Because it sounds like he knew his lineage. It sounds like he knows when he's older that he's not Egyptian. He's able to distinguish, these are my people that are forced into labor, and they're being, in this instance, one of the Egyptians was beating a Hebrew, and Moses witnessed that, and according to Moses thinking, he looks around, nobody seems to be visible, able to see the situation, and so he kills the Egyptian, buries the Egyptian who was beating the Hebrew he buries him in the sand, and he goes out the next day, and Moses goes out the next day when he sees two Hebrews fighting. One of them mentions, kind of like when Moses is kind of confronting them about their fight, he's kind of like, well, are you gonna kill us like you did the Egyptian? Are you gonna kill me like you did the Egyptian? And so Moses realizes, oh, he was actually seen killing an Egyptian, and at that point Pharaoh starts going after Moses, wanting to kill Moses. And so I'm wondering Moses' position. It sounds like he had some kind of a connection in Egypt. I would be curious to know if there's any records of Moses kind of dwelling in Pharaoh's kingdom or palace or whatever the heck, or being raised by the daughter or whatever. Because it sounds like he wasn't, the way I'm taking it in 111, or sorry, in 211 of Exodus, is that he might not have known that his people were being forced to labor, but he did know how to distinguish his kinfolk from the Egyptians, because he knew, oh, this is an Egyptian and is beating somebody who's part of my lineage. He was able to tell the difference. So I don't know if he was taught or if he just knew, but it sounds like he wasn't enslaved, because he was out wandering around and ended up killing an Egyptian. And I don't know if he really had, even if he was in the palace of Pharaoh of the kingdom, if Moses had like any kind of powerful position, because it says, when Pharaoh heard of it, he sought to kill Moses. It's kind of like, okay, you kill one Egyptian and you're raised as an Egyptian in Egyptian culture. You kill one Egyptian and now Pharaoh's going to kill you. So it sounds like there is a favoritism of the Egyptians by Pharaoh, obviously, because that's his people. But it doesn't sound like Moses was like equally treated. Like you would think if Moses was like a high, what do you call it? A high authority person, that if he killed an Egyptian who was beating a slave, that Moses would potentially be protected because he was like one of the people of the palace. That's kind of my own thinking. I don't really know if that's even sound, but that's kind of how I think of it. And the reason why I think of this is because, I mean, I know it was a cartoon, but if you know the Prince of Egypt, right? If you've ever seen that, and you see him, Moses, and as a teen or a young man, and Ramses, the son of one of the sons of Pharaoh, they're like buddies in that movie at the beginning, and they make it seem like Moses was part of the kingdom, like he was different. People knew that he was different, but he actually was protected in some way because he was able to live there, and he wasn't enslaved. It doesn't sound like he was ever enslaved, because otherwise I think he would have known that his people were being forced into labor. He would have maybe not been so like, he knew his culture, basically. He knew his own background, and he was protective of his own kin people, his own kin. He was protective of them. And so that's something that's interesting, that kind of maybe popped out to me, that I didn't really think about before, but just kind of culturally, how it's like Moses kind of walked maybe two paths. Like, he knew he was a Hebrew, but also he had a position where he wasn't necessarily killed as a baby, and he was basically living, and he eventually flees to Midian because because Pharaoh starts pursuing him to kill him after he killed that Egyptian who was beating the slave. And so that's when he comes across Jethro. So the recent Parsha, if you follow the Parsha from last week in the Jewish readings, the Parsha from last week was about Jethro. Jethro is the father-in-law of Moses. Um, so basically, he's the priest. Jethro is the priest of Midian. Moses flees from Pharaoh, gets to Midian. He goes to this well, and there's a priest of Midian who lived, in that region. He had 7 daughters that came to draw water. They filled the troughs to water the flocks. So something interesting about cultures, um, usually that is a role of boys in those types of societies. If you look at like a lot of Middle Eastern and African cultures, even today, that are still very traditional, like the ones that are traditional, where people have the flocks and they kind of have shepherds and they're out, like, with the flocks and things like that. When you look at those ancient cultures, you often see young men, boys, not like super, super young baby boys, but like a certain age. But I would still consider them young. Like, they're like, usually when I watch documentaries and stuff, they seem to be younger than 18. Like, they're not married. They're usually not married age. They're usually like younger, like teens and younger than teens, but like old enough that, they're capable of like having the skill of like keeping the flock together, making sure you're not losing the animals. A lot of these cultures too, they say how long they take to like get to the actual water source. The water source usually isn't like right there. They're not like, oh, there's a well in my yard and I'm just gonna go like as the distance to my backyard to like feed the flock that's like right there. Like, you're taking these animals usually a distance to a communal well that people from all around the region would be using. And it's in the heat. We're in the desert. We're in Midian. um I don't know how far Midian is from Egypt. I'm gonna look that up. um Let me see. uh so if I look up that distance, um let's see. uh some people say about 18 days, 360 miles away. um Let me see. Some people say 700 miles. So how Midian is located about 700 miles east of Egypt. So let me see. Oh no, I don't know. I don't know how I'm in Google Maps trying to look this up. Um, that's not gonna work. I'm not. That's not what I was trying to do. Um, so let's see where Midian is. Um, it says Northwest Arabian Peninsula. So if you look at Egypt, yeah, it's pretty far. Um, why did he go that far though? I don't know. I don't know how far Egypt's reach was. Um, but it looks like um it's far. It's far from Egypt, basically. Next to the Gulf of Aqaba. So, and it's like bordering the Red Sea as well. So Midian is far, uh, to say the least. It's far from Egypt. Um, so he definitely fled far away. And in this story where he's in Midian, and basically there's this priest of Midian who has these daughters. Um, Now I don't know much about Midianites. Who were these people? Um, but basically, he leaves Egypt. He leaves the Hebrews, and he's in this whole other land with these other people. And he ends up getting a getting married um, to one of those daughters, and uh, uh, he marries the daughter named Zipporah. They have a son named Gershom, which is where I was confused the other day about where that name came from. So it's Moses' son named Gershom. So that's Moses' first son. Um, Eventually, back in Egypt, the king or Pharaoh, I don't know if there's a difference between king and Pharaoh, but I mean, I see the word pop up a lot, but I don't know if they're referring to the same person. But basically, it says the king in Egypt died, uh, and the Israelites were still enslaved at that point, and that's when, you know, Moses starts getting more involved. So at this point, Moses is the one who's looking after Jethro's flock, the priest of Midian's flock, Jethro, and he's the one that's looking after the flock, and eventually asks permission to leave after seeing the burning bush and getting that message from God. He leaves. He goes eventually to Egypt in 418. It sounds like there was no struggle. All Jethro says is go in peace, and so uh, he goes back because there's nobody looking to kill him anymore. So Moses goes with his wife, his sons, a donkey. They go back the 700 or however many miles, 700 or 300 or however many miles to Egypt. The three of them, or I don't know how many sons he has actually by this point, but it says sons, plural, so it sounds like he has more than just Gershom. Him and Zipporah have more than just Gershom. And then they there's this kind of strange situation that comes up where basically I'm trying to look at this story. It's kind of a weird story. Let me see. I don't understand it. There's probably a lot more depth to it than what I can come up with or notice, but there's just some random part about you know the Lord trying to kill Moses. And this happened at a place where they were spending the night, and that's the time when Zipporah circumcised her son. I don't know about the significance with these things at all, but um, and then Aaron goes to meet Moses in the wilderness. I don't know how they even like find each other. Like you're in the middle of nowhere. And I don't really know the story of Aaron too well. Um, but basically, like they said, is a Aaron is a name that's also an Egyptian name, and so the name of Aaron and the name of Moses are Egyptian names. Um, and, you know, when Moses and Aaron are together, basically, they go to Pharaoh and say let my people go so they can celebrate this festival in the wilderness. And that's where all these problems start arising again. This is the third Egyptian ruler that we see from Joseph on. So from Joseph, there was one ruler, or I don't know how many rulers during his time period, but there was a ruler. There was a ruler during Moses' childhood, and now, later on, after he marries Zipporah, um, whatever that Pharaoh was in Moses' childhood, he dies, and you know, basically Moses is supposed to go back and get the Israelites. And so um um they were basically supposed to go do this festival in the wilderness. Why in the wilderness? Why 3 days? Why would they be going there? I don't really know the significance of those things in chapter 5 of Exodus, but it keeps going on talking about um, that they need to go into the wilderness to do these sacrifices. And basically, Pharaoh's like, heck no, that's not going to happen. And so he puts more strict demands, saying, the Israelites the Hebrews are lazy. So let them go get their own straw, because up until that point, the Egyptians were providing the straw for the making of these bricks, which was part of the slave labor, and then they ended up not doing it. They weren't meeting their quotas because they weren't being given the straw. Pharaoh told them not to give them straw, and for that reason, then they were getting beaten. I don't know who was getting beaten. It sounds like the taskmasters were getting beaten. Maybe the servants too. I don't know. It says the Israelite supervisors saw they were in trouble. So I don't know who exactly was getting punished, but it sounds like people were definitely, unfortunately, getting punished. And then what happens is we take all those sons that were mentioned from Jacob's lineage, including Joseph. All those sons all had lineages. So it talks about Reuben and his lineage, talks about Levi and his lineage, Gershon, wait, let me see. Yeah, it talks about Gershon and his lineage. So Gershon is the son of Moses, remember? It talks about all these other people whose names I don't really know. Merari. Let me see. So it says it says later on. So this is in 620. So talking about Moses and Aaron's parents, it says the families of the Levites according to their genealogy. It talks about Amram married Jochebed, his father's sister. So father's sister is an aunt. So somebody married their aunt. So Amram married Jochebed, which is the aunt, and bore Aaron and Moses. So yeah. So and these were the companies that were formed. So it was almost like this kind of you know, formation of like when I hear company, I think military, organization. You know, there's some kind of strategy with the groups and organization of who's doing what, division of labor. And so this was occurring before they even left, before God gave a command to Moses and Aaron, while they were still in Egypt. And so all this, I don't really know if there's like too much that I can really say that kind of comes to my mind, but just the one thing that's sticking out to me is that there's definitely a lot of proof of a couple generations of Israelites being involved in Egypt since the famine, when they were getting the grain, when the brothers went to get the grain from Egypt, and then when they all kind of went to Egypt. Joseph had been there for a lot of his years. He died and was buried there. Jacob and his whole lineage, they were already in Egypt. And it sounds like there were no problems until that new Egyptian ruler came in to power. And it sounds like there were no kind of problems until that new leader came during Moses' childhood. And so, yeah. And for them to have the names later on with that father Amram who married Jochebed, the aunt. I don't know who Amram is, but it sounds like they're both Levites, right? Because it says that one person of Levi's lineage went and married Jochebed, who was his father's sister. And so, yeah, they would have been the same lineage. So, it's just interesting stuff. But, I mean, I love Egypt. You know, it's just such it's such a fascinating thing to study. And, you know, I think maybe I didn't fully realize how in depth, you know, Hebrew culture started in Egypt, and then the organization of the religion of Judaism came out of, you know, once all those laws were being given at Sinai, you know, there were all these laws and things that started popping up. Well, not popping up, that's not the right word to use, but Up until that point, before that, they were basically an Egyptian heritage, and then before that, they were in the desert on their own.